Welcome to episode 4 of the Leading Complexity video podcast. This is where we explore the art of leading organizations in today's complex, hyper-competitive landscape. In each episode, we will explore cutting-edge strategies with some of the foremost thinkers in leadership. Join us and discover how to make your organization thrive and lead in a constantly evolving world. My name is Tomas Björkholm, and with me I have Mikael Göthe.
Yes. In today's episode, we will listen to very interesting conversations with Bonitta Roy. She's an author, a researcher, complexity thinker, business developer, and teacher.
But before we do that, I would like to reflect a little bit about the last episode we had, the one with Erin Mayer, where she was talking about how culture could be expressed as absolute positives or solving dilemmas, and she had a preference for the last one. And this made me think about why I have kind of a problem with the value worlds from Scrum, but at the same time, I love the values of Agile, the Agile Manifesto. And I understood that the reason why I don't really like the value words of Scrum is because they are these absolute positives, like focus, openness, respect, commitment, courage. I mean, there's no real alternative to this. This is just absolute positives. But if you look at the Agile Manifesto, where you talk about individuals and interactions over processes and tools, that is solving a dilemma for me because there are good things in processes and tools, but if you have a conflict between having a process and tool and having people to interact with each other, we should have a preference for individuals and the interaction. So that is expressing like a dilemma rather than just a lot of positive words. But when I continued thinking about it, I was also thinking about the difference when top management are kind of making decisions by budgets, like saying, do we like this? Should we do this project? And they say, yes, we should do that. But the problem for the developers later is when they see a lot of projects, they don't know which one is most important. And everyone, the only thing they have is that it's within the budget. So yes, we should do it. But if I have a dilemma between should I do A or should I do B, it doesn't help us. That's why it's so much better to have this stack or rank ordered list, like A is more important than B. So if I as a developer have to decide should I go for do A or should I do B, then it's very clear for me that I should do A first, and then when I have nothing more to do with project A, I should be working on project B. So any reflections from your side?
Yeah, I was thinking also, Erin May talks about the importance when it comes to values and culture, so that the should help people in everyday decision making. But the same goes for strategy. And I've noticed that often strategy can be expressed also like sometimes as these absolute positives. For example, we will create fantastic customer value, or we will do this amazing products, etc. But that doesn't really help you in everyday decision making either. So also expressing the strategy as priorities, we will go for in the England market before going for France, for example, or that there is a trade-off.
Yeah.
So it also goes for strategy, I think.
Yeah, and probably if we continue thinking about it, we will probably see this in a lot of different places. But let's leave Erin for now and back to Bonitta, the topic of today. Mikael, you know her quite well, don't you?
I've known her for quite some time now. I got introduced to her, and I kind of followed her for several years. So she's similar to the thought leader Dave Snowden that we've had uh, at CRISP a couple of times before, and in our leading complexity program as well. So if you like his kind of work, understanding complexity, I think having that perspective kind of deepens your understanding of complexity, which makes it more practical as you apply it in everyday work. And when Bonnie, as she's called by everyone, she is another person that you could also learn a lot from when it comes to kind of understanding complexity. And she has such an amazing broad background. She has done studies in complexity science, natural systems, relational processes, philosophy. She teaches a course in consciousness studies. She has done work in self-management and self-organization. And she has this business background and combine it with her academic and research. So yeah, really, really interesting. Thomas, you met her too.
Yes, actually, I took a class OPO, or the Open Participatory Organization. I think you can pronounce that much better than I can. It was a couple of years ago. It's a very interesting topic. I also met her at this conference called Dare to Develop Everyone. That was before it was renamed to the Inner Development Goals, which is a really interesting conference. And the thing I can say from when I met her, she's a wonderful person. She's a very gentle person.
Okay, so let's listen to the interview that we made with her, and then we'll kind of share our thoughts on that. Hello, Bonnie. So great to have you in our program, Leading Complexity, this year. I know you're an author, a researcher, complexity thinker, business developer, teacher. You're so many things. I think you're probably one of the broadest kind of persons that we have on the program. And
I'm exhausted.
yeah,
I'm exhausted hearing my introduction.
and you integrate so many fields. I know you study natural sciences, living system, consciousness studies, relational processes, philosophy, self-management, self-organizations, etc. So I think your work really intrigues me, and your thinking on complexity specifically. And our program is dedicated to helping leaders in complexity. So what would you say is kind of a pitfall or some recommendation for leaders working with these complex situations today?
That's a great question. So when we use the term complexity, even when I just hear it, I get a mental model of what that looks like. It'll be different for different people. People might see a vortex, a water vortex. Some people see, Peter Senge's diagrams. Some people experience, something like maybe a theater in a military theater, depending upon what workshops you've gone to. So what happens is, I want to point out that when we use that word complexity, we start immediately having a mental model or a movie or a framework that I occupy. So if you say to me, let's talk about complexity, then I'm going to be inside this mental model. And I think the biggest pitfall is that many people's mental models of complexity are not true complexity. They're complicated, or even too chaotic. Like they might not find enough order inside of their mental model, or they find too much order that's more like complicated. And so the real question here is, what is an adequate mental model of complexity? And I would say something like being a gardener, or raising children, or anything that, life is the most complex thing that we know. So anything that creates more life, I would say, is a great mental model for complexity.
Mm. And one of the key concepts that I like from you is a concept of releasing complexity. Could you explain a little why that's important?
Yeah, so that's a intentional phrase, because releasing complexity does not reduce complexity, right? We're all smart enough to know that if you reduce the complexity of the situation, if you try to isolate the variables, if you have simple linear cause and effect, that's reducing complexity, and that's not navigating complexity. So what do I mean by releasing complexity? And I always tell the story of the shift from the universe, the solar system as seen by Ptolemy to Copernicus. So Ptolemy won a prize because he figured out the math that could predict the position of all the planets in the night sky. Certainly the planets they knew up until then. And the reason why that was difficult is because if you're tracking, let's say, Mercury, it moves through the night sky like this, and then it starts to move through the night sky going backwards. That's called retrograde, you know, and people supposedly the werewolves come out at retrograde. And so the Ptolemy and the people at the time understood that the stars and the planets were moving like a sphere, but they couldn't understand retrograde. So Ptolemy said, well, this is what's happening. Mercury's moving this way, but it's moving in epicycles as it moves this way. And that would explain why it was still moving around the night sky, but when it was in its epicycle, it would appear that it was going backwards, okay? So he worked this out, Venus, I think, too, as a retrograde, and he had all the math worked out, and it was extremely accurate for the time. And you see these astrolabs now that are models of what he built. But what you see is that math was extremely complex. And then Copernicus or Galileo comes around and they say, oh, what if we looked at the solar system as if the sun was in the middle, and now everything and the planets go around the sun, not around the earth. And now the math is more predictive and simpler because you don't have cycles within cycles. And so he didn't reduce the complexity, because all the information, actually more information's in the system now, but the system, how we could model the system became much simpler. So it releases the complexity, and then it allows us to build even more explanatory power on that, because now the whole thing has been simplified, but not simplified reductively. So that's a good definition of releasing complexity.
And I think the potential here is for us working in organizations to kind of see where we have had created this unnecessary complexity, trying to manage it rather than finding more powerful, easier, more simple ways to.
Yeah. And a lot of times we know we're doing it. So, for example, you might get into a situation, a bidding war with one of your employees. And you know, if I just give in and give him the raise, the next time he's going to leverage me again. And you can see that this will never end. And you can feel that, you know, you're going to build in more complexity into the system. Or if you pay this one on the side and you don't want him to know, you can feel that you're just exacerbating the situation. It's a manager's nightmare. And what we are trying to do is teach people, just don't make that move. You have no idea how much complexity. It's not just these two guys or these two employees that are going to start, but it's all going to go around and around. And you won't even know that this incident that got really complex is actually an outcome of this instance. So we try to get people to be really confident not to make those moves. So sometimes that's what I'm saying. Sometimes we don't see that that's the situation, but sometimes we just kind of know it, and we need help or training, or we need to develop the confidence just not to do that.
Great. So your session in the program is titled Thinking with Complexity, Post-formal actors, protocols, complex potential states. So what's the kind of benefit for leaders and consultants that they will take away from that?
So thinking with protocols is about releasing complexity. So Scrum, for example, is a protocol. And you can think of the protocol as doing a lot of the work in the room, but it's quite simple. It's a quite simple protocol. You can think of OODA loop as a protocol, and what protocols do is they reduce the cognitive complexity of a task demand, right? So they're very simple. They're not rules, they're more like patterns to follow, and they tend to bias action. So it puts us in the world in these feedback loops. So thinking with protocols, how can we do more of that? I mean, we could adopt the OODA loop, but just in our daily lives, how can we turn kind of a messy desk into a protocol or steps for action? And there's a lot of people in the agile world that intuitively think in terms of protocols, and we're just trying to expand that understanding. And then one of the protocol sets that I will introduce is to move from complex adaptive systems thinking to thinking in terms of complex potential states. I won't get into that much right now because that's really the heart of the workshop or the presentation. But it just, to give you an example, and it pings back on releasing complexity, and that is when we think in terms of complex adaptive systems, which is the mental model that many people adopt when they're thinking complexity, we're inevitably setting up an arms race, right? So I'm going to spray the pests, and the pests get more immune, and they're going to come back, and or you think viruses and vaccines or bacteria and antibiotics, or even in government policy. So complex adaptive systems thinking often sets this arms race that escalates because all the systems are adapting to everyone else. And so thinking in terms of complex potential states is a way to have a mental model about complexity that doesn't enter into this escalating feedback loop. And yeah, it's a really kind of exciting thing to introduce.
Yeah, so I recognize all this escalating complexity kind of builds bureaucracy, creating organizations that go really slow, creating a lot of politics, slower decision making, all this kind of thing. So
yeah, you end up 90% of your work is managing the work you made for yourself. And I mean, we all feel this. It's very hard to get out of the system, but what if we could take small parts of our lives or small parts of our jobs or small parts of our company and protocol this way of working with complexity? I think that it's people, we need a new way.
Yeah. So yes, this will be so exciting. Really looking forward to digging into this and hearing more from you on the October 10th in our Leading Complexity program.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the other speakers too. So
yeah,
I'm happy to be part of this.
You're invited also to participate in watching the whole program. So
I will. I definitely will.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Oh, great interview. Bonnie is here talking about releasing complexity, not reducing complexity. Can you give some examples of what that is?
Yes. So one example I'm thinking of is when someone is, as a manager, someone's coming to you asking for a raise. You maybe want to solve the problem there and now to just give them a higher raise. But what you're actually doing is now you're creating a complexity in the system because others will start coming asking for raises, for example. So that is one example of when we are increasing complexity rather than reducing it. A personal example for me is when I got my first job as a manager or team lead. I had 12 people working for me. And of course, I did what was expected. So I started to manage them. And what happened was that none of them would have the right amount of workload ever. Either they were overstressed or had too much to do or worked late. Or I remember a couple coming and saying, "Oh, what shall I do now?" And they finished so quickly. I said, "Oh, you're already done. Okay, take this." And then they came back again after like 2 or 3 days. I'm done. What shall I do now? Like already? And I was really stressed out trying to manage everyone. I realized then that why don't I treat them as a team? I was coaching, working with sports team, and then kind of totally shifted my mindset. So just shared, talked about what are common goal and purpose, and creating transparency, and had them to self-organize. And that is a way of releasing the complexity then, because we're not reducing it. We didn't lose anything, but often we have a complex problem. We try to solve it by maybe making compartments or individual tasks or silos or functions. That makes, we think it make it more simple, but it's reducing complexity because we're losing stuff in between here. But releasing is when we actually cannot take another approach, leverage the self-organizing or the energy that exists, and then create new.
Yeah, because in the early in the system you described, where you were the boss and you were managing the people, then kind of you were the only one that truly understood what the purpose was, why we were doing things, and the only way for the people you were managing was to come to you and ask, what should I do next? Because they couldn't figure that out. But I guess when you saw them more or less a team, you kind of created like the environment for them and they understood, so they could themselves come up with, okay, when I don't have anything to do, I totally understand what is needed to be done, so I can just start doing it, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have kind of, Bonnie often talks about this, the energy for free, leveraging self-organizing and people's in motivation, etc. So people want to do good, but if you're kind of having to go to the manager for everything, then you can lose that. So
Yeah.
another example is vacation planning. I've seen many times that manager tries to be do the best, do the right thing, approving vacations, and you typically end up with no one 100% happy, or there's frustration, etc. Rather than just putting some frames, uh, what are the kind of guardrails around it, and then have the team self-organize and just come up with the best vacation plan together.
Yeah. Another thing I'm thinking of when talking about this reducing complexity instead of releasing is linear thinking. I know that Bonnie was also talking about that in the interview. I think it's really interesting because especially if you're quite junior boss, you think that you are supposed to manage people. That is kind of a linear thinking that I'm the boss, I tell people what to do, they should do it. That's very linear. But the world is not like that. It's not linear. It's more non-linear. So even though you say something, you ask people to do something, it doesn't mean that they actually do it, which it's actually creating more complexity. So yeah, I think that's interesting.
No. Bonnie suggests using protocols to release complexity. Did you get and have any examples for that?
Yes, I mean, she mentions two interesting protocols. One is the OODA loops, and then it's Scrum, which I know a lot about. And the idea with those protocols, I like that she calls it the protocols because it's not telling how you should perform the meetings in Scrum, for instance. It's just saying that you should have those meetings, and those are the outcomes of the meetings. And then you could experiment and adapt it to the context, how you perform the meetings, as long as you know exactly what to deliver during the meetings. And this, I mean, if you're telling like this is how this meeting should look like, you should talk about this and then about that and etc. etc., that could be very limiting, and it could be that you do that on autopilot. It just says so. I should do it like this. But instead, talk about the protocols like we should have this meeting. This is the outcome of the meeting that opens up a lot of possibilities, which is releasing complexity instead. Another thing I was thinking of that was mentioned in the interview was this about the difference between complex adaptive system and complex potential state. Um, can you explain that for us?
Well, it's what I understand of it is that complex adaptive systems is how kind of nature works and how we kind of talk about how nature is working. So when there is a change in nature, for example, life conditions change, there's more heat or rain or drought or whatever, the animals or the nature can adapt to the external environment. And also in work environment, those are also complex adaptive states. So when things are changing, we are adapting to it. There's a new managers, new organizations, then we try to adjust and adapt to it. Complex potential states, this is what I kind of Bonnie's latest research, and we're intrigued about learning more about. But actually, she sees that when there is in the system often potentials that is unrealized, this connects with this releasing complexity. So if we can do something totally different, rather than adding another process, another control, another layer of management, for example, so kind of reducing all that to or releasing it so that we can do something more simple, but doesn't lose anything of the kind of information.
So rather, instead of, if you have different opinions than someone else, instead of arguing for your sake, your solution, kind of, because then you have this adaptive system, and whatever you say will probably have that person being less interested in your solution and being more anchored in their own solution. So instead of that, go back to the actual need, the problem to solve, and talk about what are your needs and what are my needs, and maybe what are the potential states that could solve both our needs, and then talk about that. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so often if we have a belief, it doesn't really often help with arguments. If you have a strong belief of something, I'll have a counter argument, you will probably just be very solidified in your belief, and then we just keep arguing. But if we can kind of shift the whole circumstances or kind of open up, I'm thinking of an example where we wanted to create a team-based workspace, use kind of having team-based with designing the environment, the space around us, using monitor screens, the walls, etc. But there was this clean desk policy, and we couldn't do anything. And this was escalating and arguments and going higher up in the organization. Nothing could resolve it. But then we made a move, Bonnie would say, so that we took the responsible person on a visit to another company, and that kind of shifted the whole conversation, opened up everything, and suddenly we could design the workspace as we wanted, and that was a potential in that system, and we had to kind of go very indirect to make it happen. But if we just had been kind of using this adaptive thinking, we just make this situation more complex.
Yeah, so it's a very good example of releasing complexity.
Yeah,
I really like that. Another thing I liked during this interview was when she was describing how first Ptolemy, I think very early, almost 2,000 years ago, were able to describe how the different planets were moving, even though he thought that the Earth was in the middle. And uh, he was able to mathematically describe, for instance, where Mercury was. And I try to explain that by using two ping pong balls here, where one is the Earth and the other one is Mercury. And if you believe that the Earth is in the middle, it will look like Mercury is moving like this in a elliptical orbit around the Earth. But then Copernicus came 1,500 years later or something like that, and he understood that maybe it's not like that. And then he said that if the sun was in the middle, then everything would just be moving around like this, and suddenly everything was much easier. And that is also, I think that's a fantastic example of reducing complexity. Just by seeing that maybe things are not what we believe, maybe it's something else, and suddenly it all makes sense.
Yeah, that is the releasing complexity, because you didn't lose anything. The Ptolemy's mathematics actually worked. You could calculate where each planet would be, but it was super complex mathematics. It's impressive that they could do it at that time. So the mathematics became much simpler when you put just the sun in the middle. So that's very interesting.
Any highlights from your side?
Well, I think she mentioned that 90% of work is made up by us or by you. Yeah, is this when things are not working? Oh, probably we need another control, another more quality, or one employee is misbehaving, so we have to have a rule to counter that no one will take advantage of this situation, etc. And then all the rules are building on each other and creating this bureaucracy. So eventually we'll have 90% of kind of processes and rules that are often not needed.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, 90% of the time is spent on just rules that we made up ourselves. So this refers back to, again, the interview with Erin Meyer. And because she's the author of this book, No Rules, Rules, which she wrote together with Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, describing how they become very successful by just releasing complexity and by removing all those rules.
Yes, so that they had a strong culture and this high talent density they talked about. So when you have strong culture and high competence, you can reduce so many of those rules. So that's a great example. Okay, let's wrap up for today. So we're curious about your reflections. So please share your comments. And if you want to learn more from Bonitta Roy, you may interact with her in the masterclass Thinking with Complexity, Post-Formal Actions, Protocols, and Complex Potential States. So that is October 10th. Go to leadingcomplexity.com and get your tickets there. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.